Dr. Sean McFate is an author and war expert. He holds 3 professorships: the College of International Security Affairs at the National Defense University, the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, and the Maxwell School at Syracuse University. Previously, he was a social scientist at RAND and a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. His career began as a paratrooper and officer in the U.S. Army's 82nd Airborne Division, where he served under Stan McChrystal, John Abizaid, and David Petraeus. After the Army, he became a global private military contractor. He authored The New Rules of War: How America Can Win Against Russia, China, and Other Threats, named a Book of the Year by The Economist. He also wrote The Modern Mercenary: Private Armies and What They Mean for World Order, which Foreign Affairs called essential reading. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Foreign Policy, and War on the Rocks, and he has appeared on all major news networks. Additionally, McFate is a successful novelist, authoring the Tom Locke Series based on his own military experiences. #1 New York Times bestselling author James Patterson calls him the next Tom Clancy. McFate holds a BA from Brown University, MPP from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and a Ph.D. in International Relations from the London School of Economics and Political Science, LSE. He's based in Washington, D.C.
Hello, this is Dr. Matthew Canham, the Executive Director of the Cognitive Security Institute. The best weapons do not fire bullets. This is rule number 5 from Professor Sean McFate's book titled The New Rules of War. Dr. McFate argues that weaponizing influence and gaining information superiority is more central to winning modern conflicts than kinetic actions. We hope that you enjoy this presentation to the Cognitive Security Institute.
All right, so one of the things I observe is that warfare has been getting sneakier. It's been getting sneakier for the last 3 decades at least. And, the question is, what is making it sneakier? And what's making it sneakier is that we live in a hyper-information age, as we all know, as you all track, right? It's not just an information age now, it's a hyper-information age. And barring nuclear war, it's only going to get even more, hyper, So what does that mean? How does it change warfare? Well, suddenly things like subversion and plausible deniability are more impactful than raw firepower, right? And I call this sneaky war. And I'll give you some examples, is that, in Napoleonic warfare, the warfare of Clausewitz, conventional war, World War II, traditionally, whoever had the best military, had more bullets, more organization, better leadership, they won. Today, that's not the case. It's not been the case really since 1945. If you look at the US, if we're honest, the last time we won decisively a major war was 1945. In Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, we had more bullets, we had more technology for that, yet we lost, I would argue. So sneaky war is a evolving 21st century type of warfare that is not really what PME is looking at today. And the way you win sneaky war, war becomes epistemological. Where you try to manipulate perceptions of reality, and that some of the most important weapons today, as you know, do not fire bullets. Yet, of course, if you look at what the U.S. is buying, it's all kinetic force stuff for the most part. So the way you win in sneaky war is what I call loosely the dark arts, and it's kind of what you think of it: subversion, covert action, strategic deception, unconventional warfare, dirty tricks. And essentially, war is becoming less like, for all the war theorists out there, less like Clausewitz and Jomini, and more like Sun Tzu, who says all war is deception. And the ways and means that you prioritize are not firepower, but they maximize plausible deniability on the ground. and that you fight beneath the threshold, not of international intelligence agencies, but of global media. That's where, and if you look at conflicts in the last 10 years in Syria, in Libya, and, parts of Ukraine, I mean, they're all, Yemen, they're always occurring. We don't know, most people don't know about it because it's always beneath the threshold of global media. Once global media sees it, a spotlight then goes there, and, and it changes the war strategies of all the actors. And so they try to keep the global media out of it. And it often tries to wage war, but disguises it as peace to their adversaries. And the logic is simple. The adversaries will be less likely to react. So you wage war, but disguise it as peace. And again, it doesn't look like war to traditionalists. So if you're a conventional war thinker in the Pentagon, and there are many there, a lot of things that I'm about to show you won't even register as war. You won't say, is it a 100,000 person homicide? Maybe, but you won't call it war. And that's one of the problems. We are paradigm prisoners of our own way of warfare. So here's an example of all these things. Compare and contrast the way Russia took the Crimea in 2014 versus what they tried to do in 2022. In 2022, they launched a blitzkrieg, a conventional war into Ukraine, and they foolishly thought they'd take the country in 3 days. Well, when you wage war in the open, the whole world galvanizes against you. They made NATO stronger. I mean, Finland's a part of NATO, right? Versus 2014, where Russia used shadow warfare. They infiltrated eastern Ukraine using ways and means that maximize plausible deniability. For example, Spetsnaz special forces, Wagner group mercenaries, astroturfed little, these separatist units that were puppets of the GRU, little green men, and they did loads of active measures. And information warfare, and disinformation, and they blanketed all of Ukraine with the fog of war and used these units to slither through that. And while Western intelligence agencies and media were still scratching their head about what were the facts on the ground in eastern Ukraine, the Crimea was a fait accompli. And only then did Putin come out and Garamosov and others and say, oh, it was us all along. We lied to you. That's how you win. Iran and Israel, they've been in a shadow war for at least 10 years. This past 6 months has been coming out of the shadows. We'll see, they prefer to get it back into the shadows because when you're in the shadows, it gives both sides secret off-ramps to escalation. If you're in the public eye, the global public eye, you have to sometimes escalate for credibility's sake. And it creates this tit for tat that we've been seeing since April between Iran and Israel, which can be very dangerous. If you can get it under the threshold of global media and using dark arts, you have more control over the situation. And there's a lot of ways. Disguising war as peace. So if your adversary is the United States, which is an overwhelmingly conventional strategic culture, then things like debt trap diplomacy, what China does, is that war? Is that an economic policy? Well, there's no bullets in the air, so we're not going to call it war, but they're achieving war aims using economic warfare. I mean, just ask Sri Lanka. I mean, going into business, it's like going into business with Tony Soprano when you do these things. And a lot of countries have been burned. They also, China uses lawfare. This is part of their 3 warfare strategy. The first warfare is information warfare. The second warfare is psychological warfare. And the third is legal warfare, lawfare. And they try to use international law to undermine international law. Hollywood, this is talk about cognitive domain. We live in influence is now a center of gravity. Hollywood is a WMD of influence. China is trying to create their own Hollywood to surpass ours someday. We'll see how it goes. But right now, they kind of own Hollywood. Not only do they own like legendary studio, which made things like Pacific Rim and Thor and stuff like that, they also have market power. So if you want your movie to show in China so you can pay off what you owe Tom Cruise, you have to have it shown in China, and they subject it to censors, as you know. And I will tell you, as one of my hobbies is I'm a novelist, and I also work as a consultant in Hollywood. If you have a Chinese bad guy, it will never go anywhere. And think about it. When was the last time you saw a Hollywood movie with a Chinese bad guy, a Chinese villain? We have Russian villains, terrorist villains, American villains, but I guarantee there are no straight up Chinese villains. Am I wrong with that? Do you know?
I just saw again last night or the night before Spy Games.
Spy Games.
Spy Games with Robert Redford and Brad Pitt.
Oh, when did that come out? Is that?
I think 30 years ago, 25 years ago. Exactly what you're saying. Exactly what you're saying. They don't do it now.
Okay. There's going to be like, there was a Jackie Chan movie in 1994, I think. I mean, but think about it. Isn't that amazing? We have a lot of American villains, but we don't have any Chinese villains. It's because they are using, and their movies now make a lot of money. Like, if you look at movies like Born to Fly or Wolf Warrior 2, Wolf Warrior 2 is like Rambo, except we're the North Vietnamese and they're the Rambo. And that made over $100 million worldwide. And it didn't even show in America, not because we censored it, because it vilifies America. I mean, outright vilifies America. And so they're using this as a strategic influence. And, production companies like Legendary Studio, they're like Huawei or ByteDance. They, the CCP says jump, they say how high. It's not like American companies, as you know, where we can't get Apple to unlock an iPhone for a counterterrorism case in Los Angeles because Apple doesn't want to lose market share in China. So, things like Hollywood, this is now a part of what I would loosely call warfare. We don't really have a good word for it. But these are all examples of disguising war as peace to your adversary. There's questions around fentanyl. Now, we don't really know. I have not seen any evidence to show that China, Beijing is deliberately creating a fentanyl crisis, like a reverse opium warfare, but there's a lot of speculation. Weaponizing migrants, something that Russia does very effectively. They bombed civilian centers in Syria in 2016. Those refugees flood the European Union, the rise of right-wing national parties, and the Brexit. I mean, that's a strategic outcome that the old Soviets would have loved to have seen. And the Russians did this by taking conventional bomber aircraft and deliberately bombing, cities in Syria to drive that migration crisis. We don't look at this. We look at this as a humanitarian crisis, not as a war stratagem. There's TikTok, Kia Boys. So this is psychological warfare. Of the three warfares, this is an example of psychological warfare where TikTok tries to rewire the brains of youth and corrupt it. Are you familiar with the Kia Boys? Is this something that's new to you, or? Okay, well, the Kia Boys is something that TikTok's algorithms in their export version of TikTok seek to basically make it addictive to teenagers and to be antisocial, anti-self-esteem, and criminal. And we've seen TikTok and social media in general have profound psychological effects, particularly on female teenagers. In TikTok, it's outright criminality. It shows, these kids show you how to take over a Kia, to carjack a Kia in 30 seconds using only a USB drive. And if you have a Kia or Hyundai from like 2011 to 2022, you need to worry about this. They take a brick, they smash in the window, they pull down the steering column plastic underneath the steering column, and it exposes, you just turn it like a key and you can then steal it. And it created this eruption the last couple of years of kids, teenagers stealing Kias and doing these, and trashing them all over the country, to the point where like automobile, insurance agencies they won't even like insure your Kia in Milwaukee or St. Louis, right? And it's created this profound criminal movement. Now, TikTok in China, you're only allowed to do it for 4 hours 4 hours a week if you're a teenager. And its algorithms only show patriotic themes and how to do science experiments in your kitchen. That's it, right? And we know that, ByteDance tells Kia what to do because Beijing was reacting to our congressional hearings in April, saying this is out of bounds. It was pretty transparent. So that's an example of using social media to create societal friction. And of course, disinformation, which you all know a lot about, right? And here's how you win today, through subversion. The United States will never be occupied militarily, I don't think, in the near term. That's not the problem. The problem is that our adversaries use subversion, the dark arts, to find an existing rent in the fabric of our society. They pour gasoline on it covertly and they fan it so that we rip each other's throats out, right? Through disinformation. And the idea, of course, is that by 2049 or 2099, we're not defeated like Berlin in 1945. We just simply deflate. We become a first world country without first world power. We essentially become like Italy, okay? Where we once were, or UK, where we once were a global superpower, but now we're just using modern technology, but we have no access, we have no reach globally. We're not hegemonic in any area, maybe not even in our own hemisphere. And this is achievable by using the dark arts. And then again, how does a democracy fight back against disinformation without becoming an autocracy in the process, right? And so they have us here. And that's why they keep on investing more heavily in information operations. We don't know how well it's working, but we know that they think it's worth the money. Let's leave it at that, right? They keep on investing it heavier and heavier. So we're seeing our adversaries turn and exploit this new way of war, while the US is still stuck, I think, in the 20th century. And now we're in nuclear great power competition. And nobody knows in Washington how to manage it. And I want to know, can we win it? So that's my project. How do we actually win it? Now, there's generally two schools of thought on this. I mean, we can spend all day on the schools of thought, but there are generally two in the US. One are what I call the idealists. They want more, international law, more human rights. These are people like Samantha Power, the UN, International Criminal Court, human rights organizations like Amnesty International. But I find this school of thought to be, pretty impotent. I mean, why do we think that, Putin and Xi Jinping are going to now suddenly respect international law and human rights after they've risen by abusing it? So I find this perspective to not be a serious approach to the problem. Now, there is a realist school of thought too. And this is sort of what's winning out in Washington. And this is like the amazing, almost Reagan-esque rise of military spending in our country in the last 10 years. We're spending nearly $1 trillion a year on the Department of Defense. That is more than all the next 14 largest militaries in the world combined. That is more than the rest of the federal interagency combined. And what are we doing with that money? We're investing in conventional war weapons like F-35s and aircraft carriers. And same with the concepts. Our concepts we're wargaming out conventional war scenarios in the Straits of Taiwan, in the South China Sea, that again look like the Battle of Midway with better technology. It's World War II with better technology. It's 80-year-old warfare concepts. And, that's what we're obsessed with. That's what the Department of Defense, that's its strategic culture, and good luck moving it. And good luck explaining to Congress with the military-industrial complex why we maybe need to think about other types of warfare, like in the cognitive domain. And of course, the second school of thought's the most dangerous, because what they forget, which is unforgivable, is the Cuban Missile Crisis, is that the nature of war is to escalate. And what will start as a shooting war in the Straits of Taiwan can escalate into World War III nuclear warfare in 1 hour. I have talked to colleagues at RAND who thinks this is totally avoidable. I think that is nuts. The Cold Warriors knew it very well. And we have a strategic IQ lacuna in DC today that wants to invest in kinetic warfare, thinking that they can prevent this outcome from happening. If we get in a shooting war and, China sinks 2 aircraft carriers, in 20 minutes, are we going to really back away? I mean, look how ballistic the US went after 9/11, and we were at war in the Middle East for 20 years, and how much trillions in destabilization and blood was cost. What's going to happen if they take out 2 carriers, symbols of American strategic pride? Yeah, our country's going to go nuts, okay? And it can go nuclear. So this is the danger of the course of action the Washington consensus is doing. And there's even think tanks in Washington, like the Atlantic Council, who have advocated a nuclear first strike strategy against China should they invade Taiwan. I can't think of anything more ignorant or dangerous than that. But it came out a year ago, came out in November of last year. You could look it up. I'm not making this up. The point is that in modern warfare, in sneaky war, our status quo is failing us. And that's why it always feels like we're a goalie at a soccer penalty shootout. We're always playing defense. And I want to know, how do we win, not just manage? Because even the best goalie in the world is not going to be 100% effective. So is there an alternative approach? And my answer is yes, but it's going to be controversial. So hear me out. I think the best defense against the dark arts is a good offense. We have to get into the shadows and start to punch back in this way of warfare. It doesn't mean we have to imitate Russia or China or Iran's way of warfare, but we have to devise some similar American version of that we can live with. And we did it in the Cold War, and we won the Cold War. And I think this has a part to do with it. So we need to embrace the dark arts once again. We do some dark arts today, maybe around counterterrorism, but we don't do enough of it to make a difference, to move the needle. And that's what I'm going to argue in this book. So again, subversion, unconventional warfare, using proxies, covert actions, dirty tricks, deep propaganda, all of these things, right? All of those things. And it can fight, but it avoids nuclear war. Why? Because everything happens in the complex shadows. Everything happens under what we consider to be the threshold of war. And much of it's invisible to the American people, which is dangerous. But it avoids nuclear war because it avoids that tit for tat Israel and Iran are in right now, where leaders like in the Cuban Missile Crisis had to talk tough so they wouldn't lose domestic and international political support. Dark arts kind of insulates that. We can give examples of that in Q&A because it happens in ways that provide off-ramps to both sides, where they can take a licking and keep on ticking. They don't have to go nuclear, if you will. And this is in part how the West won the Cold War. They did things like trickery and deception. If you look at, there's a lot of reasons why the Cold War ended up the way it did. One of those reasons was the West's use of the dark arts. So what began, for example, in 1981 as very long lines in Moscow for toilet paper, by 1989, it was, communists trying to tear down the Berlin Wall. And we did things like have whisper campaigns. We did things like to question, the communist project that had been going on for 3 to 4 generations. We armed the Mujahideen in the Afghan-Soviet war that turned that into a quagmire that became a political nightmare for the Politburo. We did all sorts of things that were dark artsy to help this outcome happen. But after the Cold War, we largely abandoned the dark arts. There's a lot of reasons for this, but what we have seen in the past 30 years, we do it still, but it's insufficient. It's not enough, and the dark arts people are considered to be, cats at dog shows, right? Like we don't do this anymore as a nation. And I argue this is really working against us. There's a strategic cultural shift. Yes, there are parts of the government who really want to do this, but there's even larger parts who want to ignore it. So this is what a sneaky strategy would look like. So we all know that we are very vulnerable to the dark arts. We're an open society, but we are actually resilient. We are like a tree. It doesn't feel this way, but we really are. Democracies are more open, but they're more resilient to this type of warfare. Meanwhile, autocracies can wage this type of warfare very easily because they centralize power without accountability to anybody. But they're also very brittle. They're strong but brittle like glass. And I'm proposing that we target that glass using our version of the dark arts. They're not as powerful as people think. We're not as weak as people think. Let's go after that. The Cold Warriors knew it. The Pentagon is skipping over the Cold War and going right to World War II, which is the problem. So here's how it would work in practice. Imagine it like dumpster fires. I would like to call it the dumpster fire, Sean's dumpster fire strategy. You don't have to stick with that anyway. I just like, nobody always has, people always have these like wild, like, the defiant strategy or the shock and awe. And it's nonsense. So we're going to use the dark arts to produce regime-threatening emergencies for despots around the world, for nuclear autocracies, for Russia, for China. We're going to, think of them as dumpster fires, and we're going to do it for autocracies domestically and abroad. We're going to create these strategic emergencies. And given enough dumpster fires, autocracies will begin to turtle up in a defensive crouch. Because remember that, regime security is job number one in an autocracy in ways that we don't really quite understand. Regime security. And if you're running a police state, which is what autocracies are, you need a lot of boots on the ground. And if they want to secure the regime, they're going to have to pull those troops out of places like Ukraine and forward posture towards Taiwan to defend the regime back at the homeland. And this is sort of what happened with like the Wagner Group rebellion in 2023, right? I mean, we could have ushered that along, I guarantee it, rather than letting it happen naturally. And that created a panic within the Kremlin, as you recall. And if we keep the dumpster fires blazing, we can actually do it in exchange, like a deterrent or compellence. That, we will turn off some of those dumpster fires or mitigate them somehow in exchange for, them laying off disinformation, right? This is the true best offense is the best defense approach. We're not going to, if we play goalie all day with disinformation, I just feel we're going to lose because the rate of fire for disinformation is huge compared to the rate of defense, right? Here we're creating dumpster fires of our own, and we're going to mutually stand them down. They're going to stand down their dark arts. We're going to stand down our dark arts. And if they refuse, well, let them collapse inward like the USSR did in '89. Okay. The truth is that these regimes are not invulnerable, and we're going to try to create. We're not going to try to conquer them militarily. We're going to create the conditions for their capitulation. That's what we're going to do. We're going to create the conditions for their capitulation and call that victory. And this is going to take time. Strategic patience is essential. Autocracies have it because you have a dictator for life. We have every 48 years, we have some sort of schizophrenic thing. But, the Cold War took, generations. So we shouldn't expect to win wars in 4 years like World War II. So here are some ideas that we can do at scale. One is war in the cognitive domain, right? We have to find ways to unplug their minds from their matrix. They have state-run media, especially China. They live in a vacuum. We have to penetrate it using technologies, and we did this. We created Tor. We created Signal, but we didn't implement them well, right? There are can we do pirate VPNs? Can we use things like Starlink? Are there ways to get behind the Great Chinese Firewall IT infrastructure and plug into it? There are. How do we get them to, we don't have to have counter narratives. We just have to allow them to Google whatever the hell they want, and they will start to ask disruptive questions, right? And once you start to have dissent, you can take that and cultivate dissent into violent and non-violent uprisings, right? So, for example, we all remember how China had the strictest anti-COVID policy in the world. It was draconian. And they were shutting down like whole cities because of a single COVID case. They shut down Shanghai, a city of 23 million, for 3 weeks, right? It was like a prison. And people were getting angry, but they kept a lid on it because they're China. Do you remember in fall of 2023, it all popped? And there were violent protests, there were nonviolent protests around China. And China the next day dropped the policy, literally overnight. Do you remember what set it off? Anybody? Just speak up if I can't see people exactly. So the Chinese were watching, well, there were a couple of things. One, there was a fire in a Chinese apartment building where a lot of people died. Everybody was like locked in place, right? The second thing happened is that they were all watching the World Cup soccer, and they saw these stadiums in like Dubai with 80,000 people shoulder to shoulder from around the world, no face masks, shouting at the top of their lungs for 4 or 5 hours straight. Nobody was sick. And the Chinese had a collective WTF moment, right? And that's what sparked it. So my question is, let's get ahead of that. Let's us spark it. Let us trigger and manipulate that. Let's create that dumpster fire. Let's have some fun with deep fakes, and we can discuss that. I'm sure you've thought a lot about that. And an evil chat GPT, you can do defend for the cyber. We should do more offensive cyber. The cyber community wants to do it. Policymakers are gun shy about doing it. We can discuss that as well. But there are people in all these communities in our federal government who are eager and ready to do this. We don't need to spend billions of dollars and wait 15 years for a new jet fighter. We could do these things next year with a policy change. Other ideas. So these China and Russia like to brag that they're civilization states or ancient empires, and they use this as an excuse somehow to take over their neighbors. Well, let's use it against them. These ancient empires mean that they have no natural friends or allies, because every ethnic group here, every polity, every nation has been under their imperial boot at some time in the last 1,000 or 2,000 or 6,000 years. Let's use that against them. Let's create insurgencies, or let's do security force assistance on their neighbors who border them. Like Kazakhstan has the longest land border in the world, 5,000 miles with Russia. If we prop up Kazakhstan's military and they start becoming a knife in the side of Russia, that will cause Russia to have to defend a very long land border, with a handful of troops. They'll have to dump troops out of Ukraine to do that. Same with China and Mongolia. And guess what? This is why the Special Forces, Army Green Berets, were created in the 1960s, not to do counterinsurgency, but to create insurgencies in countries and to arm neighbors through security force assistance. We have that capability right now. Let's do that. Or to do economic financial sabotage. Like we have, China is having a huge real estate crisis that will make 2008 look like Cub Scouts. Let's help them in their demise a little bit. There's a lot. We own the global reserve currency. Let's use that. We are the world's #1 oil exporter. Let's use that against Russia's petroeconomy. There's a lot of clever things that we could do in the not just financial warfare, but in financial sabotage. Or how about this? And this is definitely down your lane. Putin rides around half naked on bears. Why don't we make more of that, right? Like, we are the country that created South Park. Why can't we ridicule him? Dictators are really vulnerable to ridicule because they are the state. Ridiculing a dictator is ridiculing the state and weakening the state. And ridicule is powerful because it has denigration, denigration. And denigration is how you take down ideology, ridicule and denigration. And then there's a great, so there's ways to do this. Madison Avenue knows those ways. Hollywood knows those ways. Our own internal politicians know these ways, but we don't seem to do it against our outside enemies. We can talk about this, but there's other things too. We have the best universities in the world. Let's deny access to all the princes and princelings of all these evil regimes. I'm not saying all Chinese and all Russian students. I'm saying, did you know that Xi Jinping's daughter went to Harvard in 2012, not under disguise? Harvard knew about it, but she didn't get in there because of high SAT scores. She got in there because she's Xi Jinping's daughter. And Harvard and other Ivies and Oxbridge, they do this often, right? Well, let's make a visa program where all Xi Jinping's daughter get to go to Harvard and Stanford and Yale, but Xi Jinping's daughter says, nope, you can't join them. You've got to go to University of Wuhan, and let them get pissed off at the parents and bring our water to the parents. Like, stop beating up those Uyghurs, It's a small thing, but all these things are small and they work in unison. And also, personally, that kid took a deserving seat for a deserving kid, which could have been your kid or my kid or something like that. So I'd say let's turn the princes and princelings against their parents. Okay, and lastly, again, creating insurgencies, support resistance movements. We should be doing more of that globally. Let's, in an era where plausible deniability is a way of warfare, not just a peripheral way, but a core way, let's create implausible deniability and conduct intelligence pre-bunking. We did this right before the lead up of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. The IC got it right. Nobody believed them, but let's take away the pretexts that the Kremlin was using to invade. Let's shine light on it. So let's fight dark knowledge with light knowledge, or something like that. Or let's use it against them. Let's do a jujitsu flip on them. If Russia says those little green men or those Wagner Group mercenaries are not really there, well, who's going to miss them by morning? If we take them out, what's Russia possibly going to say? Or lastly, here's my favorite, is to use shaping operations to trigger a purge or palace coup. Now, we all know how autocracies, they have studied our regime type, a democracy, and they know where its weak points are, and that's where they press. Open elections, freedom of the press, stuff like that. That's where they press, and we can't defend easily. Well, they have their own weak points. Let's study their regime type and press back. So, for example, think of an autocracy not even as a pyramid of power, but like a telephone pole of power, okay? And at the very top, you have this concentrated executive where you have the autocrat surrounded by his lieutenants, okay? And they control everything, and that's why they can move so quickly compared to democracies. But here's the problem. Their regime type is such that no autocrat gets to retire. They either die in their bed peacefully or they go out in a hurricane of bullets, and they all secretly worry about their life expectancy. And also, guess what every lieutenant's dream job is? It's to become the autocrat. That's the nature of their regime type. Let's use that against them. Let's indirectly find ways in the cognitive domain to frame them, to seed in the mind of the autocrat that one of his lieutenants or two or three want to stage a palace coup, and he will kill them for us. At the same time, or separately, we can encourage some of those lieutenants to go for the throne, and they might succeed. Either way, we're going to create super friction and distrust within that small group that holds all the power that will send ripples throughout the regime type, okay? So we don't need to just be offensive and playing defense all the time. We can give them some of their own medicine, but tailored to their regime type as they tailor their dark arts to ours. Now, I can keep on going. There's a lot more things that we could do tomorrow when we have people who are willing and able to do it, but we have policymakers who are generally are not. I want to have a discussion about that. But before we do, I want to acknowledge that there are some problems with this stratagem. First of all, we all know from like the church committee that secrets and democracy are not compatible. So how do we fight sneaky wars using the dark arts and not lose our democratic soul? Okay, that's a question that should be like a presidential debate question, not how many aircraft carriers we need or how much money DoD needs, but this is a new way of war. It's predominant in this century. We need to figure out how to do it. Defense is not enough. We need to think an offensive capability. What would that look like that doesn't imperil our democracy? Some would say categorically we should never do that. And I say that's wrong too, because what happens if we don't try? Is it slow death? I mean, you can show very clearly in the social science data that democracy and liberalism have been on the decline the last 25 years of this century. Okay, that's clear, and that includes India, right? That democracies are becoming more autocratic in Europe and America, that democracies around the world are shrinking, that liberalism is in retreat, that more people lived in democracies in 2000 versus 2024, and on this path, by 2049, who knows what it will look like. So the status quo is clearly not working. And lastly, I say to others who say that we cannot fight this way, this is not the American way of war, I would say that's not true. We did it throughout the Cold War and won. And also, is it really somehow better to lose honorably than to win dishonorably? And I leave you with that. And with that, I think we should open it to discussion.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this presentation to the Cognitive Security Institute. You may learn more about topics in cognitive security by visiting us at cognitivesecurity.institute.